Greetings and welcome to the second Fixin' Our Plate conversation that explores food systems, rural development, and climate change. We're glad you joined us tonight. I'm Deborah McGrath, and I represent the Swanee Integrated Program for the Environment. This evening it is my honor to introduce Dr. Ricardo Salvador as our second Exploring Food Systems speaker this semester. Dr. Salvador's message is urgent as we find ourselves at the intersection of the struggle for racial equality in the United States and around the world, and in what the medical journal, The Lancet, referred to as the global syndemic of obesity, undernourishment, and climate change. Roots of our current pandemic or those of future pandemics may also be found in the destructive practices of our global food system. As The Lancet pointed out in its 2019 series, addressing the societal, political, socioeconomic, and commercial drivers are double duty and triple duty actions, meaning that addressing the gross imbalances presented by our agro-industrial food system at once offers solutions to many issues, including those of public health, affordable, healthy food, racial justice, labor rights, animal welfare, biodiversity protection, environmental sustainability, and regenerative, not exploitative food systems. Dr. Ricardo J. Salvador is Director and Senior Scientist of the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists in Washington, D.C. He is a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems and on the Board on Agriculture and Natural Resources of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. He advises a wide range of organizations advancing food system innovation, including the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, Food Corps, the Center for Good Food Purchasing, Food System 6, the Land Institute, and the Fair Food Program of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Prior positions include Program Officer for Food Health and Wellbeing at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and Associate Professor of Agronomy at Iowa State University. A native of Mexico, Ricardo's academic background includes undergraduate studies in agriculture at New Mexico State University and MS and PhD degrees in crop production and physiology from Iowa State University. And I hope he'll forgive me for saying this, but he is a marathon runner, a mindset that must serve him well as he leads the long distance to the just and regenerative food systems. Please join me in welcoming Ricardo Salvador.
Thank you very much, Dean McGrath. I appreciate being here. And I understand that your first speaker was a good friend of mine, Anthony Flaccavento, which I know sets a very high standard for what you're expecting to hear in your series. So I'm going to start sharing my screen to talk to you about a topic which is a difficult topic. And tonight we're going to try to cover at least 400 years of history, which means that I'm going to have to hurry along. I'd like to get started by acknowledging the fact that as a nation, we're in the midst of a racial reckoning. That's going to be my major theme. And where I would like to end up is with the argument that the way that this society has been structured, having been started as an agrarian society very much along a racist model, is something that both needs to change and that we can change. But in order for that to occur, we all need to have the motivation to do that. And the motivation, I believe, comes from understanding how we arrived at the point that we are right now. How the very fact that George Floyd's murder on the streets of Minneapolis this summer is directly related to the fact that we began as an agricultural society. So I want to jump into that by demystifying some of the mythology that we have about agriculture in this nation. And I want to do that by reading to you this tweet that was published on the 5th of February, the day after the president gave his State of the Union this year. So as you can see, it came from an official government account for the Bureau of Land Management. And they say, "Thank you, real Donald Trump, for the shout out to the American West. Our ancestors braved the unknown, they tamed the wilderness, they settled the Wild West, they laid down railroads, and they dug out canals. So at the Bureau of Land Management, we are, in your words, making it greater than ever before." And what I'm referring to when I say that this is a mythology has to do with the black and white words that you see in front of you, that this was a continent that was unpeopled, that it was wild, that it required taming, that there was no infrastructure, that it required people to civilize it, to bring it into proper order, and that that's what constitutes the greatness of the present nation. So that's a mythology that is embodied in the generational histories of families like the one that you see embodied here, the settlers, the colonists that essentially went into that so-called wild, untamed land. And it's embodied in lots of different ways. I'm going to mention one or two ways as I go along, but one of them might be a poster like this, which you find across farmhouses throughout the Midwest. This one in Kansas. I don't know whether it was original, but in this particular home, it was enshrined, and it basically brought back the memory of how these original acres came into the family that was displaying this. So I want to go through this history in a little bit of detail, but where I want to start out is by understanding in as sympathetic as way as possible the situation of American farmers, about 2 million people. However, that number actually belies a very complicated truth about a population that is far from monolithic. And to help us understand that, I'm going to call in the former Secretary of Agriculture, Mr. Tom Vilsack, to walk us through that. And as you listen to this taxonomy of US farmers from Secretary Vilsack, if you are in agriculture, try to locate yourself in the taxonomy.
I hope that folks would understand the situation of the American farmer. And I don't expect you necessarily to be totally sympathetic, but I want you to know who these people are. You know, for the most part, there are about 2.2, 2.3 million people that are characterized or qualify as farmers under our survey at USDA. It only takes the ability to raise about $1,000 of product for sale to be a quote unquote farmer. But 1.3 million of that 2.2, 2.3 million are folks who are doing something in the back of their home out in a rural area. They may be growing some strawberries. They may be growing some apples that they turn into cider, and every year they take it down to the farmer's market for a couple months. They sell a couple $1,000 worth of stuff, and it's a good thing that's taking place. But they're not making any money off this. They're just doing it because they enjoy doing it. So that leaves about 1 million people that we, if you went out and talked to the person on the street, would ask, define for me a family farmer. They're probably talking about these people that do farming, if you will, for a living. Of that number, about 700,000 of that number are small to medium-sized operators who sell less than $250,000 worth of product. In the best times we've had in agriculture, in the last 6 or 7 years, record exports, in some years, record income. These folks averaged about $10,000 from their farming operation. $10,000, which means that the vast majority of that 700,000 folks, they are working on the farm, they're working off the farm, and their spouse is working on the farm and off the farm. They struggle, but they love the land, they're connected to the land, and they want to stay in the land, and we want to help them. And then you've got the other 200,000 to 300,000 that are commercial-sized operations, and they're doing pretty well.
So remember that figure of 200,000 to 300,000 farmers that the Secretary of Agriculture is telling us are the folks that are actually producing the majority of the nation's agricultural output. But there's something else about farmers that I also want to mention, and I'll do this with statistics that come from the Department of Labor that rank the occupations by ethnicity. And I'm just going to take a look at the upper decile, so the top 10%. And I want you to notice something if you were not aware of that. For instance, let's take a look at electricians. They're 90% white, carpenters are 91% white, steelworkers 92% white. But up at the top of the classification, the second whitest occupation in the United States is farmers and ranchers, exceeded only slightly by veterinarians. So 96% in round figures of farmers are white. It means if you wanted to call a whites only meeting without calling it that, you essentially call a farm meeting. And that's how you produce a whites only meeting in the 21st century United States. I've experienced it myself many times. So this is not a natural outcome. This is clearly an engineered outcome in a nation where the white population is 2/3. So I want to examine the history of that. And I also want to acknowledge that this is a system that, aside from being engineered, preserves itself, with in-groups and out-groups, and that there's a definite structure and therefore definite results, definite outcomes of that structure of agriculture along racial lines. So this is a difficult topic. I warned you at the outset. And so now I want to spend a little bit of time putting you at ease about the fact that we're going to jump into a very difficult topic. I'm going to give you at least 3 reasons why you should be at ease. I'm not about calling out anyone. I want us to be able to have a genuine conversation about the kind of country that we want to be and how we want to treat each other. It's often the case that, given our backgrounds, we could be in exactly the same place and interpret exactly the same situation in radically different ways. It's a very common social phenomenon. So I want to tell you just a little bit about myself, if you'll indulge me, so that maybe I can build a little bit of trust with you and you can listen to what I have to say about this very difficult topic. Now, I want to start out by telling you about Mama. So this is Mama, Ruth. I'm very fortunate that we still have her. She's 89 years of age. She's not doing particularly well these days, but as I said, we're very happy that we have her. And it isn't just because she is my mom. She is one of the saintliest women that I know. She is a missionary, still at the age of 89, is responding to that calling. Protestant, fundamentalist, evangelical. She raised me and my siblings reading the Bible, going to church at least 3 times a week. No whiteness from being raised by this woman. By the way, I should take advantage of the fact that I'm speaking to a group in Tennessee to tell you that our family history through her branch of the family runs through Tennessee. They're largely Flemish American, although, a very typical Northern European goulash. Came through the traditional route, New York, immigrated to Pennsylvania. The family was in Paris, Tennessee for a while, and then eventually went south and was part of a group of families that established present-day Hamburg, Arkansas. And nobody's particularly proud of this, but they clearly made the decision to go further south during the Civil War because they were for slavery. So this is family history. I understand it well. I love Mom's family, but you should know that what happened was that she went to Mexico as a missionary. She had originally planned to go to China, but China was communist and closed to Protestant missionaries when she was young. So she ended up going to Mexico because she had learned Spanish in her native state of California, going to essentially work with the farm worker population in the Central Valley of California. And in Mexico, she met Dad. And Dad is a Native American man from a group that in Mexico is known as Zapotec, although, the internal demonym is Benezat. And that's where I come from. And so what that means is that from the time that I have consciousness, I'm aware of the fact that I experienced a different world as I was tagging along by the hand of my mom. You see her here at an advanced age, but she was hazel-eyed, flaming blonde woman when she was young. And so the experience that I had when I was with her was radically different from the experience that I had when I was tagging along by the hand with my dad in his own country, in his own native country, where his ancestors have been for thousands of years. So I experienced that differentiation, which is outright racism, in Mexico, and could recognize it fully when I came to the United States to go to school. So I want you to be aware that I understand whiteness from the inside. When I visit Mom's family in California, who are well-to-do farmers in the dairy industry, I recognize that within the bosom of both of these families we have exactly the same values and exactly the same dialogues with our children. We boost each other by reminding ourselves how much we value family, how much we value hard work, entrepreneurship. And it didn't dawn on me for a while that one of the reasons that my father's family were so materially poor, something that bothered me when I was young, which drove me to study agriculture, had nothing to do with knowledge about agriculture or technical knowledge at all. It had to do with who they were. That no matter how hard they worked, they were never going to emerge out of poverty. And that's why I'm interested in the topic that we're all going to be discussing tonight. So that same experience that I first learned about in Mexico turns out to be exactly the same experience that the United States has gone through. So one reason why I want you to be comfortable with this conversation is that I hope I'm not speaking to you as an outsider. I understand this topic from the inside, from the bosom of a very conservative, very traditional white family, but with the benefit of a perspective that I have by accident of birth. Now, the second reason why I want you to be comfortable with this topic is that we're going to be talking about race. I'm a scientist. From the scientific standpoint, it's a completely made up concept. It's a utilitarian concept. At present, there is only one human race, even though as little as about 40,000 years ago, from what we can tell now, there were probably about 4, maybe 5 different races of hominids populating different parts of the planet. But at present, only one survived, Homo sapiens. Either because we were the wildest or the most ferocious, but we're the only species of human right now, basically an interbreeding population, the scientific definition of a race. I want to read to you from a passage that was authored in 2019 by the American Association of Physical Anthropologists. For reasons that should be obvious to anyone living and breathing and aware of themselves in 2019 in the United States, the society found it necessary to issue this statement on race, but also it's ironic because the whole reason this society exists was that it came into being at a time when we were trying to come up with justifications for why some people were better than other people, the concept of race. So let me just read through this. You can follow along with me. They say that race does not provide an accurate representation of human biological variation. It was never accurate in the past, and it remains inaccurate when referencing contemporary human populations. Furthermore, humans are not divided biologically into distinct continental types or racial genetic clusters. Instead, the Western concept of race must be understood as a classification system that emerged from and in support of European colonialism, oppression, and discrimination. So we'll dig into that more in just a little bit. But here's the punchline. Thus, racism does not have its roots in biological reality. There's no genetic difference among any human on the planet. We shared exactly the same set of chromosomes, but in policies of discrimination. So because of that, over the last 5 centuries, race has become a social reality that structures societies and how we experience the world. So here's the thing that I want to underscore. In this regard, race is real. As racism, both have a real biological consequences. So race is real, as is racism, and both have real biological consequences. So the reason why I've dragged you through this is to, first of all, underscore, impress on you the fact that race does not exist among the human population, but we don't have the luxury of just claiming that and then going on as if that were true. It is true, but we behave as if there were different races, and that's what matters. Because we behave as if there were different races and make important social economic decisions based on that, then we have to contend with the racism that results. So that's how it can be both simultaneously true that there truly is no race difference among the human population, but there is racism. So that's the second reason why you should feel comfortable having this topic. We all know it's been made up. And here's the third reason. It was not made up by you. I'm assuming I'm speaking to a mostly white audience. That's something that the pandemic is not allowing me to verify. I'm just going by the statistics of your university, the demographics of your part of the country. So I can't see that for myself. So there's my assumption. But you were just born into this. You didn't create this. It was people a few generations ago that created this very intentionally. And I'm going to be speaking to that in just a little bit. So that means that if we want to rectify some of the grave social inequities that this society embodies, that we have entirely at our fingertips the possibility of making different decisions on different values than our ancestors made and creating a different future. That's what this talk is about. So you didn't create this, remember that, you were just born into that. Now, if knowing some of the things that we're going to discuss here, we decide that we want to continue as things are, then that's a different discussion. But I'm just going to assume that we all want to have a society that truly embodies some of the highest values upon which the nation was founded and that we don't live up to. So that's the setup. 3 reasons why I don't want anybody to be put off by the fact that we're going to be talking about the fact that agriculture in particular is a racist project, explicitly a racist project. It's at the core of this society. Now, in order to do this, I want to talk some history. Obviously, that's implicit in what I've stated already, but I also need to talk some economics. And this is not going to be economics or history according to me. I'm hoping that this basically reminds you of stuff that you've heard previously in your education, whether at higher education level or just in your primary and secondary education. These are very simple concepts. I want to start out by reviewing the notion of wealth, because I want to talk about the grave social inequity in terms that are measurable. And one of the key ways of doing that is in terms of our economic differences in the country. So fortunately, there's a very well-developed theory of wealth. As a matter of fact, it was the first organizing principle for what today is the discipline of economics, trying to figure out what wealth is and how we create it, how we build it. So the punchline is that economists have concluded that there are factors of production that are operational in order to create wealth. The first factor of production is land. Everything comes from the land. It isn't just that we farm the land, it's also that we mine the land, or that we cut stuff that grows on the land, like forests. You may think that you are dematerialized because you're sitting there in a virtual environment, staring at your computer and not connected to the land, but that land is made of materials. It's made of ores, the silicon that's necessary to make it work, the electricity that's required in order to drive it. All of those are directly related to stuff that came from the earth, or water that runs through the earth, that cycles through the atmosphere and the earth and so on. So land is factor of production number 1. Without actual land, you can't begin to build wealth. Second factor of production is labor, because of course you need to convert those mineral ores or that water, or somebody needs to farm, somebody needs to cut down the trees, turn them into timber, build furniture out of that, and create the manufacturers that those raw materials enable. So that factor is labor. And the third factor of production, I've already mentioned, it's what economists refer to as capital, but it's not quite what you may be thinking of. You may be thinking immediately of financial capital, but to an economist, actual capital is the things that we manufacture and that we exchange with one another that we find of value. The financial capital is basically how we keep track of our transactions, but the actual capital is the stuff that we make and that we find valuable and that we exchange with one another. So you essentially take land, combine it with labor, you create capital, and if you accumulate that, you're building wealth. Now, an additional feature of this theory of building wealth is something that to economists is known as Ricardo's beautiful idea, and it's named after the economist, the Scotch economist, David Ricardo, who came up with a notion that today we know as comparative advantage. And it's the idea that if in each corner of the planet, we each specialize in doing the things that we do best. So for instance, combining the land in that corner of the planet with the labor available in that corner of the planet to manufacture the capital that is appropriate to that corner of the planet. So say raw sugar in Brazil or ethanol in Brazil versus computers manufactured in China. Then we all benefit. So the benefit comes from each of us specializing in the things that we all do best and then trading among one another. That's essentially the theory of building wealth. Now, let me underscore that word. It's the theory of building wealth. Now, let's suppose that you were perverse. Let's suppose that you weren't interested in some people building wealth. So you have an algorithm here for creating poverty. You essentially just reverse these dynamics. So if you really wanted to make people poor, you would make sure that they didn't have access to at least one of these factors of production. So either land or labor, and therefore they wouldn't be able to express their entrepreneurship. They would have no capital, and they wouldn't be able to exchange anything with the formal economy. They would be invisible to the formal economy. And that's how you create wealth. When you find poor people, what you need to ask yourself is, how is it that these folks either don't have access to land, and or their labor is not valued, and therefore they're not able to express their entrepreneurship, aren't able to generate capital, aren't able to trade with others for things that are valuable. Okay, so there's the theoretical part of this. Now, I mentioned that I wanted to go through this as background to understanding the inequities in wealth in one of the wealthiest nations on the planet, in aggregate, one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. So to do this, I want to show you how this breaks out demographically. So here's the breakdown of the demographics of the nation. So remember when I told you that 96% white farming population is not what you'd expect, that's a manufactured outcome. It's because of this. The nation is 60% white. Barely over 1% First Peoples survive. About 14% are African American. About 18% are a goulash that we call Hispanic. We don't have time here to get into that. In the United States, what you all mean when you say that is those people from south of the border. So let's compare that with wealth. So the first thing to notice about this is that there is white poverty. And so you see it marked there. Now, these are all figures from 2018, the latest available figures from the Census of Agriculture, clearly predating the pandemic, which will severely change these figures. But let's go with the figures that we have. There is 10% white poverty. But what you need to compare against that is not the poverty rate against necessarily the demographics, but just the poverty rate between these different demographic groups. So the poverty rate for First Peoples is twice the poverty rate for white folks. And actually, I fast forward there too fast. Let me come back here. So the poverty rate for First Peoples is twice what the rate is for white folks. And similar figures apply to the African American and to the Hispanic population. Now, so keep that in mind. That is disproportionate rates of poverty. And there are facile explanations for that. You all know them. I mean, you may be too embarrassed in polite company to mention what they are, but we all know them. They're in the back of your mind. They get expressed in lots of ways, but usually they're along the lines of, well, these people just worked hard like we did. If they pulled themselves up from their bootstraps, if they were just entrepreneurial, if they would study, if they'd apply themselves. Clearly, they're not doing all those things. So that's why they're poor, and that's why they deserve to be poor. So that's why we're going to spend the majority of this hour digging into that. So I want to start out by marching through each of those factors of production and how they map to the poverty rate of each one of those demographic groups. And obviously, we need to start out with land. So as you know, the land that the United States now has, it's basically its primary source of wealth is land that was appropriated, and it was appropriated wantonly. The artifice that was used in order to appropriate is known as the accumulation of a number of writings and experiments with trying to rationalize why one set of people could just willy-nilly displace other people and take their land, that today we know under a collection of documents that are called the doctrine of discovery, because the thinking evolved over time. But you could go read these. They're fascinating, particularly as they evolve over time. I'll save you a lot of effort and just tell you there are two main things that come out of the doctrines of discovery. The very first one is that a very direct translation of what they conclude is Europeans saying to the Native American population, we give ourselves permission to take your land because we are Christian and you are not. That when you pour through these documents, that's essentially the distillation of that. Second point, and this may actually sound like it's actually poking fun at the gravity of the situation, but the rationale is embedded in the doctrines of discovery. It was the core definition of private property. And the easiest way of saying it is, look here, we see no fences, therefore there is no private property, therefore you have no claim to any of this land, therefore we can claim it, and we'll put up fences and we'll claim private property. So with that set of rationales, we have the justification, in a legalistic sense, totally artificial, but in a legalistic sense, the rationalization for taking over that land. However, you still had the issue that there were folks that populated that land. It's difficult to come up with accurate estimates, of course, but there are estimates that run from something like about 30 to 80 million Native Americans living on the continent at the time of European contact. What is a little bit more certain is the estimate for what that population was within the present day continental United States, and it was somewhere near 10 million people. So you still have the problem that there were 10 million people there, even though you made up the rationale for taking their land. So how do you justify that? Well, here you see a quotation from a paper in the middle of the 19th century. The Indians are ignorant, they're abject, they're debased by nature, whose minds are as incapable of instruction as their bodies are of labor. They have nothing in common with humanity but the form, and God has sent us to destroy them as he did to the Israelites of old, to similar tribes. So one way of translating is they're savages, they're not humans. You see that clearly implicit in this and manifest in lots of different ways, leading to the massive land grab that constituted what that Bureau of Land Management tweet that I quoted to you claimed was settlement and progress. It's essentially a massive land grab. Here you see the way that it was advertised to the folks to whom the ostensibly public domain land was then given. Here you see that the authority came from the Secretary of the Interior. Here you see what it took to remove that population, a record kept by the, what today is the Department of Defense, back then was the Department of the Army. About 220 recorded skirmishes and battles, most of them massacres. I want to underscore one in particular, the last one, Wounded Knee in 1890, just outside what is today the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. So this was a massacre of about 300 Native Americans, 300 Lakota. It was mostly old people, women, and children who were dancing dance that was called the ghost dance. It was a circle dance, and essentially they believed, they'd been taught by a Paiute holy man that if they did this dance, that the good times would return. So they were performing this dance and basically spooked the local garrison. This was on the next to last day of that year. So it was cold in South Dakota, and the body that you see here is in rigor mortis. It isn't just because of the cold, because the Army had to figure out for a number of days what they were going to do with these bodies. And what they decided that they would do is something that I want to use to draw a very stark image with more contemporary history. But before I do that, let me let you have a look at the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. And I want to point out, and so let me refresh your history. The Second World War was done in 1945. So 3 years later, because of the horrors of the Holocaust that were documented primarily by the Western armies, so by the Allies, the United States being foremost, essentially to limit ever in the future the scourge of genocide. So here's the Convention on Genocide with 5 major points that identify what genocide is. And I want to march you through those. The most obvious one, obviously, is directly killing members of the group. And here's what I mentioned. This is what the Army decided that they would do with the 300 people that they massacred at Wounded Knee. This image should be familiar to you. It's a mass burial of folks that were massacred. There's a very good reason why it should be familiar to you. It was essentially the same way that many Jews were killed during the Second World War. This is a very famous picture. And I also want to tell you that Adolf Hitler was born the year before that massacre in South Dakota. When he was young, he tells stories of essentially idolizing the history of the United States. He was born in Austria, as you know. He played cowboys and Indians when he was young. He admired the history of the Americans basically eliminating the native population to liberate all of that productive land for the productive colonizers that came after them. And that was something that was embodied in the marrow of American culture. So here's one of the icons of American culture, Thomas Jefferson. If ever we are constrained to lift the hatchet against any tribe, we will never lay it down till that tribe is exterminated or driven beyond the Mississippi. Remember, this is at the time when the United States was the 13 colonies hugging the Atlantic coast. So in war, they will kill some of us, but we shall destroy them all. That was the design. Here's another example from subsequent president, William Henry Harrison. Is one of the fairest portions of the globe to remain in a state of nature, the haunt of a few wretched savages, when it seems destined by the Creator to give support to a large population and to be the seat of civilization? So that's the stuff that's coming out of the United States and that is being basically lionized in Europe, and that is driving a lot of immigration from Europe to the United States. And so compare that directly with stuff that Mr. Hitler wrote in his ideal, Mein Kampf. It is inconceivable that higher people should painfully exist on a soil too narrow for it, whilst amorphous masses which contribute nothing to civilization occupy infinite tracts of a soil that is one of the richest in the world. So you can see where he got those ideas, even though at his time, what he was thinking of in terms of expanding what he called the Lebensraum of Germany was to the east and to the north of the Germany that existed when he was young. But you can see how these two ideologies were essentially compatible one with the other. So killing members of the group, item number one of genocide. Item number two is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Here's Lord Jeffrey Amherst giving specific instructions to his armies. You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race. Or another example here from Benjamin Franklin himself. If it be the design of Providence to extirpate these savages in order to make room for cultivators of the earth, it seems not improbable that rum may be the appointed means. So causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group took lots of forms, but one of them was explicitly to eliminate their foodways, the ways that they survived. So either what they were able to grow or cultivate or what they were able to hunt. And once you eliminated that, which constituted the majority of the rituals and the day-to-day occupations and the culture of most of the Native American groups, that meant that truly for them, the world had come to an end, that there was no more meaning to their lives. They became utterly dependent on the food that the military chose to make available to them and to the rum, per the instructions of people like Amherst. So it was intentional that they were made completely dependent, those who were not killed off. So causing serious bodily harm is something that was done in the United States. Deliberately inflicting to the group or on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. That food that I mentioned to you, that essentially was what people depended on in order to survive, was the best controlling tool that the US military had once they'd actually concluded all of those different massacres and skirmishes that I showed you just a little bit ago. And that reduced the lifespan. It increased the mortality of infectious disease among the Native American population. And you know that if you basically fast forward to the present, among the Native American population, you have some of the most immiserated people on the planet, in the world, not just in the United States. They suffer disproportionate rates of suicide, child mortality, things such as lack of education, low educational attainment, high rates of diabetes, some of the highest on the planet, and some of the highest rates of obesity on the planet, because that food that we make available to them is essentially some of the worst food for human beings. So this was deliberate. There is no accident. When I say immiserated people on the planet, be conscious of what that means. That does not mean that they're intrinsically miserable. It means they are made miserable, in the same way that they're not intrinsically poor, but impoverished, made poor. So let's go to the next one, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group. There's so much to say about this one. I just want to point out that as late as the 1970s, the Indian Health Service was still sterilizing young Native American women without telling them what they were doing. I hardly need to say anything more about the intentionality of that. And then lastly, forcibly transferring children to the group to another group. This is something that I strongly identify with, because the tactic was to take Native children away from their parents and put them up in boarding schools, all the way from Kansas to Pennsylvania. This is taken at the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. And the administrators of the Carlisle School were particularly proud of taking pictures that we can now use in ways that they didn't intend. This is a group of arriving Chiricahua Apache at Carlisle, and then 3 months later, the result of the beginning process of Christianizing and deprogramming and acculturating these young people. There's a very famous case of the Navajo Mr. Tan Torlino on his arrival at Carlisle School, and then again upon his graduation. So the folks running these institutions essentially rationalized what they were saying by telling themselves that what they were doing was civilizing these folks. That if these folks basically accepted Christianity, that if they learned English, that if they became civilized, that then they would have access to everything that American culture had to offer. Now, I need not remind you that that's conquest. It means give up everything that you are, all your beliefs, your language, everything about who you are. Become one of us. That's conquest. So, genocide. Now, I want to give you one particular illustration of the fact that this is a continuing dynamic. I'm noticing the time and I can't give you the full details of this. I just want to tell you that you're seeing here a wagon full of Chiricahua Apache led by the gentleman who I'm highlighting here. His name was Tuhulhuts, although you would know him by the name that the Spanish gave him. The Mexican army called him Geronimo. And that's because this small band fought against both the US Army and the Mexican Army simultaneously. And here they're being shipped off to Florida because after 3 times of being captured, they refused to be conquered. Pretty much the same way you would refuse to be conquered in exactly the same circumstances. And so as punishment, the ultimate punishment, they were sent off to Florida. Just want to point out to you some of the rationale for doing this. This comes from a letter from General Carleton to Colonel Kit Carson, 1863. Say to them, this is to these Apaches, these Chiricahua Apaches, go to the Bosque Redondo or we will pursue and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. Remember, they're talking about people that were on their own land. This war will be pursued against you until you cease to exist or move. And this was Tuhulhuts basically reacting against that. The contrasting image that you see here is from the defense or the protest against the XL pipeline going across South Dakota and into Iowa, carrying tar sand oil from southern Canada. Same people, very similar issues, basically sovereignty over their land, in this case, the quality of their water. You can see that not much has changed from the middle of the 19th century to the early part of the 21st century. So, in summary, remember that this is about factor of production number 1, how you build wealth, how you explain how some people have built wealth over the generations and others have not. And in the case of Native Americans and land, it basically has to do with the explicit official government policy, the policy of this nation of genocide, plain and simple, documented by exactly the same protocol that the US created in order to supposedly condemn and prevent genocide in the future after the Jewish Holocaust during the Second World War. So the consequence of that was that of the 10 million natives that existed in the continental United States in 1492 at the time of European contact, they essentially were diminished to a bottleneck of about 250,000 people at the beginning of the 20th century. This population is now rebounded to about 5 million, but essentially with the characteristic of being overwhelmingly poor. You saw the figures, twice the poverty rate of the white poverty rate, connected to the loss of their land, their food sovereignty, and essentially their identity and the meaning of their lives, their culture. I want to move quickly on to the second factor of production, which is labor, but we can't go past this without acknowledging the fact that a second massive land grab was essentially to divide the country of Mexico into 2 and to take one of those halves and make it what is today the southwestern United States. That was done in the Mexican-American War. Here's President Polk, who essentially oversaw this, stating that it's of great importance to the country generally, and especially to our navigating whaling interest at the Pacific coast, and indeed the whole of our territory west of the Rocky Mountains should be speedily filled up by a hard-working and patriotic population, hardy and patriotic population. So, you know, again, trying to reduce all of these things to you. Essentially, the argument was those are Catholics and we're Protestant, and so we're taking over their land. So you know that this was the era where the mental software, the rationalization for performing this displacement, both against Native Americans and taking territory from Mexico, was the so-called manifest destiny. You're very familiar with this image, the angel of progress. You can see over on your left, I'll point out how it's all dark, how it's all light over on the right. The right is the east, from whence the civilizing force of progress comes. The left is basically driving out the native population together with the herds of buffalo that they hunted, together with a native prairie species, plowing all of that up, replacing it with farming, which is definitely seen as part of the new technology, the railroads, the telegraph, the stagecoaches, the navigable waterways, all of which Europeans considered to be what the Bureau of Land Management in that tweet called taming this land. So manifest destiny. Let's talk about the second factor of production, labor. So prior to the discovery of oil, when you wanted to extensify agriculture, you needed to extensify by bringing more land into cultivation, and that meant finding people that will do that menial work for you. And then the United States, the model of what today we know as plantation agriculture, which among other things is very large scale agriculture conducted for the purpose of essentially extracting, in the case of the United States, shipping the products of that plantation agriculture across the ocean in what was then the incipient mercantile economy of the rapidly globalizing world. And so the labor was essentially abducted from Africa. Massive contracting networks were established to perform the abduction, to transport the captured Africans to the American continent. The majority of them went to Brazil, throughout the Caribbean, where there was massive tobacco and sugarcane production. About 12 million total over a period of about 350 years. But about 3 million and a half of them ended up in the United States, and their descendants are among us. And that labor was essentially brutalized, treated as property, treated as animals, not paid for the labor that they performed, terrorized, and even after emancipation, when ostensibly we recognized that they were humans like we were, we essentially excluded them from participating in the wealth that their labor had helped to create, because it was essentially the labor of that agricultural economy that enabled the lifting up of what economists call the secondary economy, the industrial economy, that wealth that was built up from all the agricultural activity of the early plantation days in the history of the United States. That exclusion continues to this day, but during the Jim Crow era, particularly terrorism was a tool that was used in order for this population to receive the message, remember your place. Remember that we didn't build this culture for you. And what I want to point out to you is that you can't get over something that isn't over. This is not about history. This is not about something that happened deep in the past. When I mentioned the middle of the racial reckoning, I'm happy to report to you that polling since the murder of George Floyd tells us that now a majority of the white population of the United States accepts that there is systematic racism and discrimination, particularly focused on the African American population of the United States. And that's the beginning. That's at least a foothold to begin to have the conversations that we need to have in order to right the wrong that began with agriculture, which is, here is menial, brutal work that we're not going to perform for ourselves. Let's come up with a rationale whereby we can abduct people, separate them from their families, eliminate their language, their culture, treat them as if they were animals, and say that that's divine. Say that that is something that is good. Say that's something that is building civilization. Rationale in the case of the Native Americans was they were savages. Rationale in the case of African Americans, if you're familiar with the three-fifths argument, is that they're not fully human. Just kind of human enough that they can understand instructions, not fully human like the rest of us. So you can't get over something that isn't over. Now, in the realm of agriculture, one of the ways that this manifests is that in the South, the land-grant universities that were created to provide the education and the technical knowledge and perform the research so that farmers could increase production and build their wealth was not extended to the freed African-American farmer population. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in just a little bit. So a completely different set of land-grant universities, state agricultural colleges, were set up about 30 years after the mainline, the jewels, the crown jewels, the flagship land-grant universities were set up. These are called the 1890 land-grant universities, and because of time, I won't go into this full story, but to this day, they do not receive the formula funding, the government funding that they're supposed to be getting. They continue to be the B team. They continue to be excluded. And I want to point out, this is what I mentioned just 2 seconds ago that I wanted to come back to. Imagine the end of the Civil War, 1865. Ask yourself where the expertise for agriculture was at that time in our history. So remember, the Homestead Act passed in 1862. So as of yet, the Central Valley of California is still ranching land. It's still populated mostly by folks who just a generation previously had been Mexican citizens. They're still ranching in California. And throughout the Midwest, you essentially have prairies. You have some of the first homesteaders beginning to receive their land and to begin to farm it. But the agricultural expertise of this nation was the African-American population, 3.5 million people whose major job was to perform the brutal labor of plantation agriculture. And you can bet that the white plantation owners were not producing their own food in their home gardens. It was the same population of enslaved people that was also producing the food. So if we were acting rationally and asked, there's this new boon of agricultural land that we're opening up, who are the people who are most skilled? We would have essentially made the African-American population full participants in that settlement of that stolen land, stolen land, appropriated land, but we would not have made that an exclusively white domain, which is actually what we did. And furthermore, we actually explicitly worked against utilizing the expertise of the African-American population, drove them into debt very explicitly as a pretext to take their land so that white ownership could prevail. Now, I'm going to ask a friend of mine, Aneem Steele, to tell us a little bit about what might have been.
So when I was 30, I went to work at a farm. It wasn't a typical farm. It was part of a wonderful organization called the Food Project. And in addition to growing fresh vegetables for low-income neighborhoods in Boston that didn't have access, this farm had the mission of growing leadership of teens from the city and suburbs, and of linking them together to each other and to the land. I love this job. And one summer, I gave a tour to a group from Oakland. And we walked across the field. We zigzagged through the plots of corn and squash and cucumbers. And when we got to their side, and most people filed into the greenhouse, I noticed that there was a person standing back, an African-American woman who had turned to face the way that we had come. And curious, I went to stand next to her, and I noticed for the first time that there was a little hill that made the spot with which to view the whole farm. And I could see the 30 acres we had just crossed. I could see the stone wall, very New England stone wall, and the trees in the distance. And through the trees, I could catch a glimpse of the new 10 acres that we had just begun to farm. It was a beautiful day, so I just paused to take it in. And we stood there on the hill for a few moments, not saying anything. But when she spoke without turning her head. She said, "It's so big. It's so much land. I've never seen what 40 acres looked like before. I've never seen what my ancestors were promised but never received." I thought, how could I have missed that? Looking out at that 40 acres now, I had a feeling of an ache for what could have been and what should have been. Her words were bringing me back, recalling a moment in time after an unimaginably ugly history of enslavement, when there was this glimmer of hope. In 1865, right at the end of the Civil War and the dawn of emancipation, Union General William Sherman and President Lincoln's Secretary of War came down to Savannah and actually sat down with a group of 20 Black ministers and listened to their vision of the future. And it was actually a bold and comprehensive vision that they presented. And land was at the centerpiece. One of the ministers was Reverend Garrison Frazier, who had spent 60 years in slavery. And this is what he told two of the most powerful men in the nation. He said, the best way we can care for ourselves is to have some land and to turn it and till it by our own labor. And we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. And incredibly, that vision, that idea to give each freed family 40 acres and a mule, was approved by President Lincoln and administered by General Sherman. And for a while, it was promising. Imagine what might have happened had the masses of people emerging from bondage been able to have some property and some land and pass that on to their children. As a biracial African American, it's not so hard for me to imagine. That's the promise of the American dream that my white ancestors arriving from Ireland and Germany were able to hold on to. And I don't think it would have changed everything. Wouldn't have solved everything, but it would have been the foundation of a much more just and equal society.
So Anim has described to us what might have been, and instead here is what actually happened. So whereas in 1920, the figures for this are very difficult to come from because the USDA explicitly utilized the tool of either not collecting or of hiding data so that we couldn't track what was going on. But to the best of our knowledge with the data that we do have access to, is that in 1920, 14% of the farming population was African American, and due to systematic exclusion and discrimination, that is presently 2% of the farming population. So we did nothing of the kind of saying rationally, where is the agricultural expertise and how can we do the best thing for everybody, for every citizen of the nation. By the way, you should know when I keep repeating, you can't get over what isn't over and that we're not talking just about history. If we had more time, I'd give you some of these details. If you're curious about the following, you can just Google and have a look. Look up the Pickford lawsuits. And you'll find that the USDA was found to be guilty of systematically discriminating against African American farmers and women, and had to pay out billions of dollars in penalties. Same thing, look up the Keepseagle lawsuits against the USDA, same thing, found guilty of systematically excluding Native American farmers from benefiting from the programs of the USDA. So it's no surprise why farming numbers declined and why these families were not able to build up wealth in the same way that white farming families were able to build up wealth. And don't lose track of the big picture. We're keeping track of the factors of production by which we build wealth generation: land and labor. So here labor was essentially appropriated. It was not remunerated proportionally to what the value was worth. And that's why you end up with generations of poverty, an era during Reconstruction that Eric Katznelson has called when affirmative action was white. Now, it is not the case that that period is behind us, as I keep insisting. For instance, we didn't say, after slavery, we now know that rather than just stealing that labor, now we need to pay the fair price of labor. The model is still in place, as today's farm workers will tell you. They just tell you that it's evolved in a very sophisticated way. You still have people that need to be out there performing the most brutal menial labor without workplace protections that you and I would expect in our place of work, including being exposed to some of those noxious chemicals that we synthesize, that we manufacture for control of pests. And these are folks that are actually subjected to exemptions to other labor protections that apply to all the rest of us and that exist just for farm workers. So for instance, workman's compensation, number of breaks that you get during the day, things like access to insurance programs, to benefit programs, to retirement programs. Most people actually would think that's laughable. If you're thinking in the back of your mind, well, wait a minute, why would they, catch yourself? Why are you even asking the question why you are entitled to those benefits in your place of work and these folks aren't? And without these folks, none of us eat. That's the end of the story. These folks are essentially the folks that do the menial labor that enables the entire food system to operate. So, here's where we say, if these people only work hard, if they were only entrepreneurial, if they had any skills, if they only try to lift themselves up by their bootstraps the way that the rest of us have done. Among some of the other exemptions that apply to this population are that, as opposed to the rest of us who are expected to have our kids in school, you can have children as young as 12 years of age legally out in the fields. So we know exactly what we're doing. We know exactly whom we're doing it to. These are all examples of racist policies, specifically racist agricultural policies. Specifically, it shows you that agriculture is a racist project. I know that none of us think of it that way. I know that none of us who are engaged in agriculture would necessarily want it to be that way. That's why I think that there's hope for having a conversation. But we have to recognize without these folks, the dairy industry doesn't exist, the restaurant industry doesn't exist. So therefore, we don't have the food system that we now have. And yet we see these folks as interlopers. We see these folks as less than. And whereas for the Native Americans, the rationalization was they are savages, and for African Americans is they're not fully human. What is it for these folks? It's they're not legal. And so I want to talk to you about that a little bit. I want to quote to you from this gentleman. It's not necessarily a good reflection on our culture that some of the deepest observations about how it works come from a comedian. But here's what Chris Rock says. He says, I used to work at McDonald's making minimum wage. You know what that means when somebody pays you minimum wage? You know what your boss was trying to tell you? He's trying to say, hey, if I could pay you less, I would, but it's against the law. So let me talk to you about this. This may seem like I'm going far afield, but let me just tell you that there are hard, cold facts about the universe which we can't change. So speed of light, the gravitational constant, as a scientist, we can talk all day about those things. But when it comes to our culture, just about everything about the culture we make up out of thin air. So whether people are legal or illegal, particularly when they perform work that is essential to the economy and to the rest of us, as basic as we don't eat if they're not here performing the work that they do, whether they're legal or not, that's our choice. And we have a situation where people who are essential, we officially designate them as being essential and we say they're illegal. So how can that be? So I've talked to you a little bit about economics, which I think all of you would know, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, is a social science. I've lived long enough that just during my lifespan, I've seen us make different choices about basic laws of economics. We make up our mind about the laws of economics. So for instance, we just during my lifespan have agreed that that capital can flow across borders. So you can own a banana plantation in Costa Rica. It's perfectly legal. And a millionaire from China can buy the best farmland in Tennessee. Perfectly legal. Something else that we've decided just during my lifetime is that through free trade agreements and per David Ricardo's beautiful idea of comparative advantage, borders don't exist for stuff. We can move stuff across borders. That's why most of us are sitting in front of a computer that was actually manufactured in China, or you have a mobile computer in your pocket that was manufactured in China. And they drive American cars over there, together with cars that come from other parts of the world. We've made up those rules. We've allowed that to occur. Previously, that wasn't the case. Under mercantile economies, we had completely different views of both of those things. But when you have one of the biggest, the holiest of holies of economic rules, economic laws, supply and demand applied to farm labor, all of a sudden, this breaks down in terms of the free flow in response to supply and demand across borders. Because in the United States, there is a deficit of farm labor. And because Americans will not perform that work for themselves, then that demand is unmet domestically. So then economically desperate people from other parts of the world come to the United States to meet that demand per supply and demand dynamics. And it's to our convenience that we declare that they're illegal, because then that means that they have no legal standing to claim against any of the things that I listed that are egregious exemptions to labor law that allow us to pay them whatever we want, to garnish their wages, to not pay them at all, to subject them to all kinds of exploitation. Because what are they going to do? Sue? They have no legal standing. So it's an explicit decision that benefits all of us, that makes our food cheaper than it should be. So it's a very conscious thing that we're doing. And I want to give you just one example to illustrate this. I'm going to grab an example from the state of North Carolina because it's been well researched, but I want to give you some background information. All of the figures that I'm about to cite to you are dramatic underestimates of the truth, because the farm labor economy is in the gray economy. We don't really have full knowledge of it for the reasons that I just described. And so legally, we have a demand of about 1 million farm workers per year. Now, curiously, during the pandemic, for reasons that even if you're not particularly paying close attention, you know that this has been exacerbated. If ever you wanted to prove that the domestic workforce would meet the demand for farm labor, this would be it. Because people have lost their jobs, their livelihood is on the line. You would think that they would be open to taking any work that was available, and farms, believe me, require labor. And we see nothing of the kind. You don't see the domestic population lining up to work on farms. So there is this annual demand for about 1 million folks to work on farms. So there's a program, it's called the Domestic Guest Worker Program. Its legal name is the H-2A program. And so of those 1 million, 55,000 are supplied by this guest worker program, at least had been. The demand has been increasing, so the laws have been changing to allow more of these workers to come into the country. That's actually the example I want to give to you. So in the state of North Carolina, there was this study that was conducted by the Center for Global Development. You can look it up if you're interested in more particulars. I just want to give you some of the findings. So let me set up the situation for you. So the H-2A program works like this. You first of all need to prove to the Department of Labor that you've advertised for your farm jobs and that the domestic workforce is not applying for those jobs. So you advertised in good faith, you don't have the workers that you need, and then you get an allotment of visas so that you can bring in domestic guest workers. Those workers sign a contract that say they're only here to work on the farm. That is literal. You provide them housing, so-called housing. You should see some of the conditions of this H-2A housing, but you provide them housing. They go day in and day out just from their housing to the fields or to the dairy sheds where they work. At the end of the day, they go back. That's it for the period of time that they're allowed to be in the country, 2-3 years, whatever the period is. So what I'm setting up for you here in this table are data that will run through about 2012. And note that that includes the financial crash toward the end of this period beginning in 1998 to 2012. And what you're seeing are, first of all, on your left-hand side, you will see the number of unemployed workers, then compared against that, the number of workers that are referred by job agencies of domestic workers that decide that they want to try their hand at working on a farm. Then the number that actually show up to work on the first day, and then the number that actually are still working at the end of a farm season. Now, let me point out to you, though, that if I showed you the actual number for the bar on the left, then the numbers on the right would disappear. They would be inconsequential. And that's because there are several orders of magnitude difference between them. The number of unemployed in North Carolina in 1998 was about 141,000. Now, that's important because of the fact that that's the pool of people whom you would think would be interested in any job that they could get so that they could eat by the sweat of their brow. So you would think there would be enough people in North Carolina to supply the farm labor demand domestically. So keep in mind that you have a disproportionate column over on the left-hand side, and watch how it changes. Pay special attention to how economic conditions change, how large that pool is, and whether it has any effect on the number of people that show up to work on a farm. So let's have a look from 1998 through 2012. So you see that economic conditions essentially dramatically ballooned the pool of people that might show up for work, up to, let's just use grossly round figures, almost 447,000 people are unemployed, should be looking for work. Of those, only 143 are referred to work on a farm. So 143 begin. At the end of the season, only 10 of the 143 in the whole state of Carolina remain. So when you hear these people are taking our jobs, or these people are lazy immigrants who don't do work, I mean, you might just recall some of the things that farm worker leaders say to themselves. And this, by the way, applies all the way back to the era of enslavement of people. This is how the agricultural economy has worked from the very beginning and to this day. So don't take this from me. I want you to have a listen to the Secretary of Agriculture, the present Secretary of Agriculture.
You know, one of the groups that we may not have mentioned, actually, while we mentioned farmers and ranchers, there are a lot of employees there that need to be on the job, and it may have been overlooked, but it's still a critical part of the U.S. food supply chain is access to a stable and legal agricultural workforce. You know, these crops won't get planted, they won't get picked, they won't get harvested if you can't get it out of the field. And agriculture, as many of you know, depends on H-2A labor in the fields. And it's important not to confuse that with illegal immigration and taking jobs away from Americans. These are jobs that are contributing to the American economy by doing many of the jobs that Americans just don't want to do anymore. And this is one of them. And there's a real labor shortage of farm labor in America. And these people contribute to keeping us fed and keeping our national security throughout the food security chain in that way. And I appreciate them, and I appreciate the Department of State being very, very flexible in their ability to allow us to continue to process these workers as essential workers coming in to help our economy.
I'm noticing the time here, and I really need to wind this up, but there is so much that could be unpacked there in what the Secretary has said. Basically, a lot of it self-serving, contributing to that mythology, where farm workers are essentially inputs into the system, not folks who are earning the right to dignified livelihood, fair wages, and can aspire to the same standards of housing and the same standards of lifestyle that the rest of us can apply to. They're very much seen as inputs, basically a cost to be reduced. So let's go back to this then. We've done a review of land, labor, and therefore the capital that generations of families can build up. I hope that you have a different interpretation of this graph when you now see it. I hope that if you ever see this again, that you do not allow it to be said that you essentially have some folks in this country that are the less fortunate, or the underserved, or the disadvantaged. You have to tell the truth about why you have this graph. This is essentially a snapshot of the roadkill way to creating the modern American food system. The historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, reviewing the history of the first part of this, basically the land grab, she's the author of Native American History of the United States, basically said that when you understand the actuality of US history, you don't see it necessarily as the founding of a country, you see it as the scene of a crime. And whereas that may seem histrionic when you hear it without this context, I think you can understand it when you review just the basic elements as superficially as we have here. So clearly the narrative that I have been trying to deconstruct for you is that even in our language and our cultural concepts, we center a particular group of people who initially were very much a minority, a literal demographic minority who came upon a continent with 10 million people, a peopled continent, and systematically began to center themselves, appropriating land, appropriating labor, building wealth over these generations, and systematically excluding people from having access to that land to fair remuneration for their labor, and therefore creating poverty, as you see here. And then building out narratives about why those populations are poor. I mean, you literally have people who were given land free, telling you that they built up their wealth across the generations by pulling themselves by their bootstraps. Dean McGrath told you that I taught agriculture at Iowa State University for nearly 30 years. I had heart of gold young people look at me straight in the eyes and believed it when they said to me that they were so fortunate that God had blessed them with this fertile land, the land of Iowa. And, I can't speak to how blessed people are or not. That's a separate topic. I do know what had to happen historically for the present generation of farmers to have the land that they have and to build up the wealth that they have. So that's where we are. And so the question is what to do. Can this be redressed? First thing is to tell the truth. First thing is to know the actuality rather than the myth. So let's talk about some brutal truths here. And then I want to give you some examples of some good things that we can all do. They're accessible to all of us. But I want to refer to this foundational document that you all recognize. Famous line in its third sentence that says that the drafters of this document held these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. By the way, they literally meant all men. This did not extend to women at the time. But they did not really mean all men. They meant land-owning white men. And we have all kinds of historical proof of that. And again, it's a fascinating thing to walk down what it took to actually really build up those rights for everybody. But I want to quote to you from Senator Stevens, who, as you know, ran against Lincoln for the presidency just as the Civil War was about to break out. Here's Senator Stevens. In my opinion, this government of ours is founded on the white basis. It was made by the white man, for the benefit of the white man, to be administered by white men. I am opposed to taking any step that recognizes the Negro man or the Indian as the equal of the white man. So what we can say about this is that Senator Douglas was not confused. He was very clear about what he believed. What is problematic for all of us living in 2020, soon going into 2021, is that this might as well have been stated today. Actually, it might as well have come out of the White House, from the very top tiers of government, that belief that still continues to center some of us. And I want to underscore the reality that this nation has had economic, technical successes, that wealth has been created and built. But the thing that I want to underscore is that it took all of us to do that, not just some of us. Yet some of us are benefiting from that. Others are systematically excluded from that. So if we want to do something about that, and I began by telling you that I assume we all do, one of the things that I want to do to set this up is to remind you something that Secretary Vilsack told us when he did that taxonomy of farmers. About 11% of farmers exist in a world where agriculture works for them. They farm about 71% of the land, and they generate 3/4 of the agricultural output. It means the majority of farmers exist in a system where it doesn't work for them. As you heard the former secretary said, people have to work off the farm in order to be able to keep the land, but they do that, he said, because they love the land, they want to stay on it. That may well be true. Most do it because it's their retirement fund. It's essentially the way that they have assured that they have some capital built up. And that is fertile ground for rethinking the way that this whole system works, that for the majority of farmers, the system does not work. So I want to give you an example of what one Virginia farmer, Chris Newman, has decided. Now, because of the way that this video is blocking my view, let me see, let me reduce this. Okay, there, I think I'm doing better. I can see this to read this with you. Chris Newman has decided we resolve to evolve our business into a farming collective with a particular focus on providing opportunities of ownership for people traditionally denied such roles in agriculture, people of color, LGBT folks, and women in particular. So if this is truly a free country, you can just decide you're not going to go along with the way that things have been. You can make different decisions about about everything that I've just described to you right now. Let me give you an example of a farmer out from California, Jim Cochran. Jim Cochran is the owner of Swanberry Farms. He actually is very important if you know anything about strawberry production, because he pioneered the organic production of strawberries, which is a crop that many people swore could not be produced organically because of the pest problems associated with it, particularly nematode. I'd love to tell that story, but I'm over time already, so I'm just gonna have to cut this short. But Jim Cochran had a problem, and that is that he wanted to retire. His children didn't have a particular interest in taking over the farm, so he had to decide what to do with his farm. And he also had a principle that he really wanted to treat his farm workers well. Well, I don't have time to get into the reason for that. He wanted to treat his farm workers well. And so what he did was essentially propose to them that if they could help him figure out how to get enough extra income out of that farm so that he could cover his family's needs, that he would be quite willing to negotiate with the farm workers on his farm and actually encourage them to set up a union, very unusual for a farmer to do, so that he could bargain with them for benefits and for higher wages. And these farm laborers had no trouble figuring out what to recommend. They essentially came back to him and they said, Jim, actually in Spanish, it's Don Jaime. So Don Jaime, you're leaving a lot of money in the field. And the reason is that you have us harvest just the highest quality cosmetic berries. There's a lot of berries that get left behind that families could harvest in a U-pick or that could be processed into jams or into pies. And if you could sell all of that, you know, it's about 2/3 of the berries out there that you're leaving behind. So Cochrane continues to pick the very best, and you buy them as Driscoll strawberries and other, you know, famous imprints of organic berries. But he did set up U-picks. He did set up a farm stand where you can stop by. If you're going down to Santa Cruz, California, you can stop by the farm stand. You can go to his U-picks. So he began to squeeze more out of that, basically on the recommendation of what his farm laborers who know the farming operation better than anyone else had recommended that he do. And now that he's about to retire, you know what this man is doing? He's negotiating with his farm workers so that they buy that farm, so that they become owners of that farm. So again, there's lots of different ways to solve the agricultural equation, and we haven't been particularly imaginative in terms of how to go about that. One of the reasons why I went through that chart underscoring what Secretary Vilsack told us is that there are plenty of families who don't want their children to go into farming, who are recommending to them that it's not a lifestyle for them. You've seen that it's the majority of farm families. So what to do with that land when average farm age is 58? And that leads to the question of let's rethink, especially when that land was just given to people after being stolen, how it can be reapportioned to people who want to farm, but want to farm differently. So it's a great opportunity to rethink that. And by the way, paying fair market value to today's farmers, because as I said at the beginning of this talk, you are not going to punish people today for what their ancestors did. But speaking about that, here's another thing that can be done. South Dakota State is working with the Lakota population in their own state and basically saying our wealth, this university was built on stolen land. How can we work with you in order to rethink how you can participate in the benefits of the wealth that has been built up in the South Dakota State University campus and what we have to offer. So because of the brevity of time, I've really given the short shrift to almost all of this. I apologize to you for that, but I do want to give you a summary of some really concrete things that we can all work toward. It's just, I believe, a matter of will. So I've suggested that land reform is not a romantic idea. There's lots of reasons that are driving us to rethink who owns the land. We actually do need to think seriously about reparations that are owed to people who for generations were prevented from building the wealth that they were earning because of their labor that helped to make the country great. Again, to quote that tweet from the Bureau of Land Management. And if we are going to continue to depend on the flow of people who are willing to do the work that we're not willing to do, not just in agriculture, but in the hospitality industry, in the construction industry, you all know this, it's something that you see every day, then that means that that artifice of deciding who is legal and who isn't needs to go away. And we at the very least need to provide pathways of citizenship to the people that are performing that labor. Just in the same way that your ancestors, if they came from Europe, had a pathway to citizenship when they were doing those jobs, when it was their time to immigrate into the United States. So some of these folks may not want that pathway, but it should be offered. It's the right thing to do. So let me give you some resources here. The World Food Policy Center at Duke University has just put out about 3 weeks ago this really nice document that helps particularly white folks understand how we rationalize this bubble that we all exist in that allow us to accept the way that things are, that when somebody holds up a mirror to it, you say, well, that's brutal, but you don't realize it when you're in the middle of it and benefiting from it, how you reinforce that system. So this is a very useful tool. And another tool that I would recommend is something that we did ourselves. We worked together with one of our frontline allies, the HEAL Food Alliance, that stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, Labor. It's farm workers, food chain workers, fisher people, and so on. And we put together this document that's called Leveling the Fields. I can summarize it by just telling you that it walks you through how you reverse the results of appropriating land and appropriating labor, and therefore preventing people from building up the wealth that over generations they might have built. So I want to conclude by saying, basically, tell the truth about this. That's step number one. Not allow it to be said that there are people who are less fortunate, who are the underserved, but tell the truth. These are the folks who are the descendants of, or are themselves, the folks who were victims of genocide, the folks whose labor was stolen through enslavement, and who still to the present day do not get remunerated for the value of the labor that they provide toward building the wealth, per the sitting Secretary of Agriculture, whom you heard say those very words. So I want to conclude by repeating something that I said earlier. Always remember that what this nation is, whether recognized or not, and it mostly is not recognized, was built up by all of us. Our land, our labor, our ingenuity, our entrepreneurship, and our culture and our economy should reflect that, if you believe that third line of that Declaration of Independence that I quoted to you. And so let me ask you just to meditate before we go into Q&A on this very sharp observation from William Faulkner. Thank you very much. And with that, Dee McGrath, I'll hand it back to you, and my apologies for going long on you.
I'm the new Deb McGrath. So for those of you who've not seen me before, I'm Jim Peterman, the Director of Civic Engagement here at Sewanee. And we wanted to have an opportunity for Q&A. We're running a little over, and so we want to be respectful of time. But I want to start with one question from one of our partners, Jess Wilson, who is the head of the Southeast Tennessee Young Farmers group. And that group is working with the university to, think about how to improve local sustainable agriculture, improve the health of the community, improve the situation of those people who are serving us by growing really great locally produced food, and also to think about the large-scale, difficult social and environmental justice issues of the sort we're talking about now. So I think to keep us sort of on track time-wise, I think we'll have one question, and I'm going to let Jess introduce it.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Ricardo. I really appreciated that talk. And you brought up some fantastic resources, which mostly answered my question. But I'm just curious if there are any tips you can give me. I feel like I've been involved in agriculture for a long time, and I've been in that white bubble and not recognized it or understood it, and really didn't understand that I was in that bubble until I heard you speak on this last year. And I feel like because we live in these segregated communities, which is not an accident, we often don't see, I grew up seeing white poverty. I never understood how disproportionate poverty was in communities of color and why. And so I'm wondering, in this time of political divisiveness, how do we help to tell this story and to tell the truth in our very white community here? You've given some resources, but do you have any tips on that communication piece? How do we draw people in without kind of fanning the flames of kind of this perceived culture war?
Yeah, that's very important. it's exactly why I'm recommending that we tell the truth rather than to go for the facile mythologies, because the truth is that we have in common the same drivers of poverty across the spectrum. We are living in a time that the sociologists and the economists that study this tell us is just the present instance of a cyclical phenomenon, which is essentially growing economic inequality, which then decreases on about a 50-year cycle. And what is driving this economic inequality is essentially concentration of wealth in monopolistic corporations who translate that economic power into political power. There's a lot of very good research that actually documents very solidly how the Congress, which on average is made up of millionaires, responds preferentially to the economic interests of the wealthy. So when that happens in succeeding political cycles, then essentially you get policies that benefit the concentration of wealth in smaller and smaller sectors of society. So rather than emphasizing that that among the general population, there's a zero-sum dynamic occurring between the white population that's experiencing poverty and the BIPOC population that's experiencing poverty, it's useful to step back and say we all have a common adversary here, which is that all of our wealth is being siphoned out of local and regional economies and concentrated in these vast wealth funds that are managed in Chicago and New York City and so on. This is not to demonize those cities. I'm just mentioning that that's where the stock exchanges, the markets exist, where these dynamics play out. So I think that emphasizing that we have common things that we're trying to fight against, then that tells us, okay, we all want to fight against monopoly concentration. That means we're all interested in antitrust legislation. So that gives us ways to work together. That gives us work to be empathetic and sympathetic with, so that you don't emphasize the divisive nature. The other thing too is I was very curious in what you said, that you recognize that you were living in a bubble. As I shared with all of you, I just have personal circumstances that didn't allow me to be in a bubble. I stepped across cultures my whole life. I could do that. So I just didn't have those blinders on. I could see those sorts of things. And the more that you can travel, the more that you can visit with people that you think are dramatically different from you and experience those things, you will learn that commonality among all of these populations, the same values, the same struggles. So those two things would be things that I would recommend. Create those kinds of exchange programs. Don't let them just be random occurrences. Don't wait for them to happen, make them happen.
Great. Thank you very much. So what we'd like to do is to be able to see this just as a step in an ongoing dialogue that we're having here on the South Cumberland Plateau about these very important issues. I want to thank Dr. Ricardo Salvador for being a facilitator for us and being able to focus the issues in a way that'll be helpful. What we're going to do is schedule a follow-up discussion for the lecture. So people have a chance to take this all in, think it through, and then we'll invite those of you who've come back and join us in additional conversation. And in addition to that, the next already scheduled part of the series is the Harvest Dinner on November 6th. We'll be able to get together and share food and also watch a screening of Kiss the Ground. So we look forward to having you come back. And Ricardo Salvador, thank you so much for your service to humanity and your service to this community. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And I commend you for being open to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.